Time capsules are meant to preserve the past, but sometimes they arrive with the power to reshape the future. When Elliot Reed received a letter he had written to himself a decade ago, back when the world knew him by another name, he never expected it would force him to confront not just who he had been, but who he might still become. Some ghosts, it seems, return not to haunt us, but to heal us if only we're brave enough to read between the lines. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, an ordinary October morning made extraordinary by a single envelope. Elliot Reed stood in his kitchen, coffee in one hand and the unexpected delivery in the other. The handwriting on the envelope was painfully familiar and more hesitant than his current script, but unmistakably his own. Or rather, it belonged to the person he had once been. The return address confirmed what he already knew. 10 years ago, during his final semester of college, his psychology professor had assigned a project: write a letter to your future self, to be delivered a decade later. At 21, struggling with an identity that felt like a too-tight sweater he couldn't remove, he had poured his heart onto those pages. Now, at 31, Elliot had almost forgotten about the assignment. He had built a life that fit him, a respected position as a graphic designer at a progressive media company, an apartment in the city that reflected his minimalist aesthetic, and a carefully curated circle of friends who had known him only as Elliot. The letter threatened to disrupt that carefully constructed peace. He set his coffee down, the dark liquid rippling slightly as it reflected his hesitation. He ran his thumb over the seal, feeling the weight of the past pressing against the present. Elliot knew he should open it. Ignoring the letter wouldn't make it disappear. Yet he found himself placing it on the counter and continuing with his morning routine: shower, trimming his beard, a still thrilling ritual even after 5 years on testosterone, selecting a button-down shirt and chinos for work. Throughout his commute, his thoughts returned to the envelope waiting at home. By afternoon, the anticipation had become a distraction. During a team meeting, his boss asked if everything was all right, noting that Elliot seemed unusually distracted. Elliot apologized, explaining vaguely that he had received some unexpected news from his past. His boss, always respectful of boundaries, didn't press for details. That evening, Elliot returned to his apartment and found the letter exactly where he had left it. Innocent looking, yet charged with potential. He canceled his plans with friends, texting that something had come up. Then he ordered takeout, poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, and finally sat down at his kitchen table. The paper inside was college-ruled, slightly yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was neat but cramped, as if the writer had been trying to contain too many thoughts in too little space. Dear future me, I'm writing this from the campus library, hiding in the corner where no one can see what I'm working on. Professor Adams says, we should be honest in these letters, because no one else will ever read them. I wonder if that makes this the only place I can truly be honest. I hope you're doing well. I hope you've figured things out by now. I hope you're happier than I am. Everyone keeps asking what I'm doing after graduation. Mom wants me to apply to grad school. Dad thinks I should take that marketing job his friend offered. They have my whole life planned out, and none of it feels right. None of it feels like me. I bought men's jeans yesterday. I hid them in my closet under winter sweaters. I've been binding with ace bandages, even though my roommate Sarah says it's dangerous. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I catch glimpses of who I think I'm supposed to be. Other times, I don't recognize myself at all. I wonder if you're still using the name Emily. I've been trying out different names in my head. Elliot feels right somehow. It was Grandpa's middle name, and he was the only one who ever seemed to really see me. I'm scared all the time. Scared of disappointing everyone. Scared of being alone. Scared that this feeling of being in the wrong body will never go away. But I'm also scared of change. What if I take this step and regret it? What if I'm wrong about who I am? If you're reading this and you're still Emily, I guess I found another way to be happy, and that's okay. But if you're not Tiff, You found the courage. I'm still looking for. I hope it was worth it. I hope the pain was worth it. Wherever you are, whoever you are, I hope you're free. Emily, Elliot. Elliot set the letter down, his vision blurring. He had not expected to be ambushed by such raw emotion, by the naked vulnerability of his younger self. He had spent years building his identity as Elliot, carefully distancing himself from the confusion and pain of his early years. The letter brought it all rushing back, the suffocating anxiety, the desperate hope, the fragile beginning of some. He took a long drink of whiskey, welcoming the burn. Then he read the letter again, and a third time, trying to reconcile the person who had written those words with the man he had become. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elliot sat on his balcony watching the city lights. The letter had unearthed questions he thought he had resolved years ago. Was he free now? Had it been worth it, the surgeries, the hormone treatments, the painful conversations with family, the friends who had drifted away? He had been so focused on becoming Elliot that he rarely reflected on the journey. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Elliot made a decision. He would write back not to the past, which couldn't be changed, but to himself. He would answer his younger self's questions as honestly as he could. Perhaps in doing so, he might finally make peace with the ghost of Emily. The next morning, Elliot called in sick to work for the first time in years. His boss expressed concern, asking if he needed anything. Elliot thanked him for his consideration, but assured him he just needed a day to handle some personal matters. Once alone, Elliot retrieved a box from the back of his closet, a simple wooden container that held the few mementos he had kept from before his transition. Inside were photos he rarely looked at, his college diploma, which he had never displayed because of the name it bore, and a journal filled with thoughts he had been too afraid to speak aloud. He spread these artifacts across his dining table, creating a timeline of his journey. Then he opened his laptop and began to write. Dear Emily, it's strange addressing you by that name. I haven't thought of myself as Emily in so long that it feels like writing to a distant relative or a childhood friend rather than a former version of myself. I want to start by saying that you make it. You become Elliot. You get the top surgery you're dreaming of but afraid to name. The testosterone changes your body in ways that finally make you recognize yourself in the mirror. Your voice deepens, your shoulders broaden, and the first time someone calls you sir without prompting, you nearly cry in the middle of a coffee shop. It isn't easy. Mom doesn't speak to you for 8 months after you tell her. That pain is as bad as you fear. Dad tries harder, though he still slips with pronouns even years later. But here's something you don't expect. Aunt Kate becomes your fiercest supporter. She goes to your medical appointments when you're too nervous to go alone. She helps you buy your first proper binder, your first suit. You lose some friends. Sarah fades away after graduation, uncomfortable with changes she doesn't understand. But you make new friends who know you only as Elliot, who see you as the man you've always known yourself to be. You asked if it was worth it. The answer is yes, unequivocally yes. There is pain in becoming, but it doesn't compare to the pain of denial. The dysphoria doesn't disappear entirely. There are still days when your body feels wrong, but those days grow fewer with time. You find work you love at a place that values you. You have colleagues who respect you, though you choose not to be openly trans in your professional life. That's a personal decision, not shame. You simply prefer to be known for your work rather than your identity. You date. Some relationships end badly, others simply run their course. Currently, you're single, though there's a woman at the bookstore who's been flirting with you. You haven't asked her out yet. You haven't spoken to Mom in 2 years, her choice, not yours. That remains an open wound. Dad visits twice a year, awkward but trying. These losses are real, and I won't diminish them, but you also gain a community. You volunteer at an LGBTQ youth center, providing the guidance you wished you'd had. You find purpose in being visible to those still searching for themselves. You asked if you're free, I don't think freedom is a destination we reach, but a practice we return to daily. There are still constraints, societal expectations, legal barriers, internalized doubts. But you live authentically now. You've built a life that reflects your truth rather than others' expectations. I wish I could tell you the journey ends, that one day you wake up with all questions answered and all battles won. It doesn't work that way. But the questions change, and the battles become more worthwhile. You are not wrong about who you are. Trust that. Hold on to it during the hardest days ahead. With compassion for all you're facing, Elliot. When Elliot finished writing, the sun was setting. He printed the letter, then sat with both documents side by side, the past and present, in conversation. He felt a strange sense of closure, as if he had finally honored the scared young person who had taken those first tentative steps toward authenticity. That night, he called his Aunt Kate, whom he hadn't spoken to in several months due to the busyness of their respective lives. She was delighted to hear from him, asking immediately what had prompted the call. Elliot explained about receiving the letter and its effect on him. Kate listened thoughtfully, then suggested that perhaps this was an opportunity not just to reflect on the past but to consider the future. She wondered aloud if Elliot had become so focused on establishing his identity that he had neglected other aspects of his life: connections, vulnerability, joy. The observation stung with its accuracy. After their conversation, Elliot returned to his laptop and added a postscript to his letter. I've just realized something. In focusing so intently on becoming Elliot, I may have forgotten to consider who Elliot wants to be beyond his gender identity. Perhaps that's the next journey, not defining myself in relation to who I was, but discovering who I might still become. Over the following weeks, Elliot found himself viewing his life through a new lens. The letter had cracked open a door he hadn't realized was closed, allowing him to examine parts of himself he had ignored or suppressed. He took small steps at first. He accepted a dinner invitation from coworkers that he would typically have declined, finding unexpected pleasure in the casual conversation that extended late into the evening. He returned to the bookstore and finally asked out the woman who had caught his eye, a literature professor with a quick laugh and thoughtful questions. Their first date was refreshingly easy. Maya asked about his work, his interests, his thoughts on the book she had recommended. When the conversation turned personal, Elliot found himself hesitating at the edge of disclosure. He had grown accustomed to compartmentalizing his life, revealing his trans identity only to those who needed to know. But something about Maya's open expression made him want to be equally open. So he told her, simply and directly, expecting the usual awkward pause, the shift in expression, the careful recalibration of perception. Instead, Maya thanked him for trusting her with that information, then asked what he thought of the restaurant's dessert menu. Her response wasn't dismissive, but normalized, acknowledging his disclosure without allowing it to overshadow the person sitting across from her. As autumn deepened into winter, Elliot continued to expand the borders of his life. He registered for a creative writing class he had been interested in for years, but had never found the right time to take. He reconnected with an old college friend who had drifted away during his transition, finding that the passage of time had created space for a new understanding between them. And he made a difficult decision to reach out to his mother. The email was brief, without accusation or expectation. He simply shared that he had been reflecting on his journey and would welcome the chance to talk if she was open to it. He didn't expect a response and was surprised when one arrived the very next day. His mother's message was equally brief, but the door it opened was significant. She suggested they meet for coffee the next time he visited his hometown. She mentioned that she had been attending a support group for parents of LGBTQ+ children at her church, a detail that stunned Elliot, who had assumed her silence was rooted in religious objection. When they finally met in December, at a cafe near his childhood home, the conversation was halting and sometimes painful. His mother admitted that her struggle had never been about not loving him, but about grieving the future she had imagined. She had needed time to envision a new future, one in which her child was happy but different from her expectations. Elliot shared how her silence had hurt him, but also how it had forced him to find strength in himself and in chosen family. He showed her pictures of his life in the city, told her about his job, about Maya. He didn't minimize the challenges he had faced, but emphasized the joy he had found in living authentically. By the end of their conversation, nothing was resolved completely, but a foundation for a new relationship had been laid. His mother asked if she could hug him before they parted. In her embrace, Elliot felt the echo of the frightened 21-year-old who had written that letter, who had feared being alone. Back in his apartment, Elliot took out both letters, Emily's and his response. He had carried them with him since their writing, uncertain what to do with these physical manifestations of his past and present. Now, he knew. He purchased a journal with heavy cream pages and a leather cover that would age beautifully. On the first page, he carefully pasted Emily's letter. On the next, he added his response. Then he began to write something new, not a letter, but a continuing story. His story. He wrote about Maya, about their third date when she had taken him to a transgender art exhibit without fanfare, simply because she thought he would find it interesting. He wrote about the tentative reconciliation with his mother, and his hope for what it might become. He wrote about the story he had started in his creative writing class, a narrative exploring identity that was fiction but informed by his experiences. As the new year approached, Elliot found himself planning a small gathering at his apartment. Maya, Aunt Kate, his father, two close friends from work, and his writing instructor who had become a mentor. It would be the first time he had brought together the different facets of his life, allowing them to overlap and intersect. The morning of the gathering, Elliot received an unexpected message from his mother, asking if she could attend. Her request included an acknowledgement that she would understand if it was too soon. Elliot felt a moment of hesitation, then typed his response. She was welcome, and he was grateful she wanted to come. That evening, as his apartment filled with conversation and laughter, Elliot observed the connections forming between the people he cared about. Maya deep in conversation with his writing instructor. His father and Aunt Kate reminiscing about family holidays. His mother, somewhat reserved but present, admiring the photographs on his walls. In a quiet moment, Maya joined him in the kitchen as he prepared coffee. She commented that he seemed different from when they first met, more open, more present. She asked what had changed. Elliot considered his answer carefully. He explained that a letter from his past had reminded him that becoming himself wasn't a destination he had already reached, but an ongoing journey. The parts of him that had been Emily weren't errors to be erased, but stepping stones that had led him to the present. By acknowledging his complete story, he had found a fuller way of being Elliot. Later, after his guests had departed and he was alone with Maya, Elliot showed her the journal where he had preserved both letters and begun recording his continuing story. She read the entries with care, occasionally looking up to meet his eyes with understanding or to ask a clarifying question. When she finished reading, she suggested that perhaps the greatest gift his younger self had given him wasn't the reminder of how far he had come, but the permission to keep becoming. Emily's courage in articulating her hopes and fears had created the possibility of Elliot. Now Elliot had the same responsibility to create possibilities for his future self. As they sat together in the quiet of his apartment, Elliot felt a sense of integration he had never experienced before, as if the fragments of his life were finally arranging themselves into a coherent whole. He would always be transgender, and that would always shape his experience of the world. But it was just one thread in an increasingly rich tapestry. The letter that had arrived on an ordinary Tuesday had indeed changed his present, not by altering his identity but by expanding his understanding of it. The frightened college student hiding in a library corner had reached across time to deliver an unexpected message. That becoming yourself is not a single transformation, but a lifetime of small, brave choices. and for perhaps the first time, Elliot felt truly ready to make them.